May 20th, 1942. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto reviewed the operational orders for what would become the decisive naval engagement of the Pacific War. His plan was brilliant in its complexity and overwhelming in its force. 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 44 destroyers would converge on a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific. The Americans, he calculated, could muster perhaps 2 carriers against his 4. The element of surprise would be absolute. Japanese naval codes, changed just weeks earlier, were mathematically unbreakable according to his cryptographic experts. The encryption system employed by the Imperial Navy had been studied by Japan's finest mathematicians, who assured Yamamoto that American cryptanalysts would require years to penetrate it, if they could penetrate it at all. What Yamamoto didn't know was that 3,800 miles away, in the basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters in Pearl Harbor, a team of American cryptanalysts had already read his orders. They knew the target. They knew the date. They knew the forces involved down to individual ship names. They knew the deception plan designed to draw American attention away from the real objective. They had cracked what Japanese experts considered an impenetrable code system, and they were about to turn Yamamoto's carefully planned surprise attack into a carefully prepared ambush. The mathematics of cryptanalysis, it would turn out, was more powerful than the mathematics of naval warfare, and the invisible battle being fought in basements with pencils and IBM punch card machines would determine the outcome of the visible battle fought with bombs and torpedoes on the Pacific Ocean. The story of how American codebreakers won the Battle of Midway before a single bomb fell, before a single aircraft launched, before Japanese and American forces even sighted each other, represents one of history's most remarkable intelligence achievements. It demonstrates that in modern warfare, information superiority can overcome material disadvantage, that mathematical genius deployed in basement offices can be as decisive as courage displayed on flight decks under fire, and that the nation which masters the invisible realm of encrypted communications holds an advantage potentially more powerful than any battleship, any aircraft carrier, any weapon system visible to the human eye. What the Japanese Navy was about to discover, to their shock and ultimate defeat, was that their most secure communications had been transparent to American eyes for months, that every operational order transmitted by radio had been read in Washington and Pearl Harbor before it reached Japanese fleet commanders in the field, and that the surprise attack they had so carefully planned had become the trap they would sail into with their eyes wide open, unaware that every move they made had been anticipated, every position plotted, every intention known to an enemy who was waiting with deadly patience. The foundation for American victory at Midway was laid not in 1942, but decades earlier in the 1920s, when a small cadre of cryptanalysts began studying Japanese naval codes with the understanding that future wars would be decided by those who could read their enemies' secrets. The effort started modestly, almost accidentally, driven by a handful of brilliant minds who understood that the introduction of radio communications into naval warfare had fundamentally transformed the nature of military operations. Lieutenant Lawrence Safford, assigned to the Office of Naval Communications in 1924, recognized that radio transmissions were transforming naval warfare in ways that most officers hadn't fully comprehended. Unlike the age of sailing ships where fleets could disappear over the horizon for weeks or months, operating with complete freedom from observation and making surprise attacks with relative ease, radio-equipped navies of the modern era broadcast their positions and intentions with every transmission they sent. The electromagnetic signature of radio communications meant that every message, no matter how encrypted, revealed something about the sender. The volume of traffic indicated activity levels. Changes in call signs suggested organizational shifts. Radio direction finding could locate transmitting ships with increasing accuracy. The challenge, The enormous intellectual challenge that Safford recognized was breaking the codes that concealed the actual content of those intentions. In 1924, the United States Navy began monitoring Japanese naval communications systematically, establishing the foundation for what would become one of the most successful signals intelligence operations in military history. Listening stations were established in Hawaii, the Philippines, and along the West Coast, each monitoring specific Japanese radio frequencies around the clock. These stations intercepted thousands of encrypted messages monthly, recording them on paper for transmission to analysis centers. Most were completely undecipherable using the cryptanalytic techniques available at the time, but even encrypted traffic revealed patterns that trained analysts could exploit. The volume of messages indicated fleet movements and operational tempo. Changes in call signs suggested organizational shifts or the formation of new task forces. Radio direction finding, though imprecise in these early years, could sometimes locate transmitting ships, or at least determine whether they were at sea or in port. Safford understood that cryptanalysis was not simply a linguistic exercise, but required mathematical sophistication, pattern recognition abilities, and the capacity to exploit even tiny mistakes in enemy procedures. He began recruiting not just language experts who could read and write Japanese, but mathematicians with statistical knowledge, statisticians who understood probability, and chess players who could think in abstractions and recognize patterns that others might miss. By 1930, a small team designated OP-20G was attacking Japanese naval codes full-time, representing one of the first dedicated military cryptanalytic organizations in American history. Agnes Meyer Driscoll, a civilian cryptanalyst with extraordinary mathematical gifts, who would become known as the mother of American cryptanalysis, made the first significant breakthroughs against Japanese naval systems. Working with primitive mechanical calculating aids that would seem absurdly inadequate by modern standards, she identified the fundamental structure of the Japanese fleet code that American cryptanalysts designated as Blue Book. Her methods combined classical frequency analysis, probable plain text attacks, where she made educated guesses about message content, and pure mathematical intuition that allowed her to see patterns where others saw only randomness. When Japanese operators made small procedural errors, as all human operators inevitably do, no matter how well trained, Driscoll exploited those errors ruthlessly and systematically. A single mistake, perhaps a message sent in both old and new codes during a transition period, could reveal the entire mathematical structure of a new encryption system to an analyst with Driscoll's capabilities. The Japanese Navy used multiple code systems simultaneously, each designed for different security levels and different types of traffic, creating a complex web of encrypted communications. Merchant shipping used relatively simple codes that were easier to manage but offered minimal security. Administrative traffic about routine matters used more complex systems that provided reasonable security for non-operational information. Operational orders, the messages that detailed fleet movements, battle plans, and strategic intentions, used the most sophisticated codes available, with regular changes designed specifically to prevent prolonged exploitation by enemy cryptanalysts. The primary Japanese operational code, which American cryptanalysts designated JN25, employed an ingeniously designed two-stage encryption process that Japanese cryptographers believed was mathematically unbreakable. First, words and phrases were converted to 5-digit numbers using a code book containing approximately 45,000 entries, an enormous compilation that represented years of work to create. Each entry in this codebook represented a word, phrase, or concept, allowing relatively complex messages to be converted into sequences of numbers. Then, in the second stage that provided the real security, these 5-digit code groups were added digit by digit to 5-digit numbers from an additive book containing 300 pages of random numbers, creating the final encrypted groups that would be transmitted by radio. The resulting encrypted message appeared to be nothing more than a random sequence of numbers. And without knowledge of both the codebook and the additive system, the message was theoretically unreadable. Breaking JN25 required obtaining or reconstructing both the codebook that converted words to numbers and the additive tables that disguised those numbers through mathematical addition. Neither task was straightforward or simple. The codebook alone represented 45,000 separate entries that had to be discovered through patient analysis, educated guessing, and the systematic exploitation of any errors or patterns that appeared in the encrypted traffic. Each individual code group had to be identified and its meaning determined, typically by finding it in multiple contexts and comparing the surrounding groups until a pattern emerged. The additive system, using 300 pages of random numbers applied in constantly changing sequences, seemed specifically designed to be mathematically unbreakable through any form of statistical analysis. The additives were genuinely random, not following any discernible pattern, and they were changed regularly according to complex schedules. Japanese cryptographic experts who designed these systems had studied Western cryptanalytic techniques extensively, examining the methods used to break German codes in World War I and the theoretical work published in cryptographic journals. They believed that JN25's two-stage system, combining a massive codebook with random additives that were regularly changed, would resist any conceivable attack by enemy cryptanalysts. Their confidence in this assessment shaped their operational security practices in ways that would ultimately prove fatal. Messages that by all rights should have been delivered by courier to protect their sensitive content were instead transmitted by radio because Japanese commanders had absolute trust that their encryption would protect their plans from enemy eyes. The expansion of American cryptanalytic efforts accelerated dramatically after 1938 as war in Asia intensified and the likelihood of American involvement increased. The Navy established additional listening posts across the Pacific, each dedicated to monitoring specific Japanese radio frequencies around the clock in all weather conditions. Intercept stations at Pearl Harbor, Corregidor in the Philippines, Guam, and Bainbridge Island in Washington state recorded every Japanese naval transmission they could detect, creating vast archives of encrypted messages that flowed steadily to analysis centers. The intercepts came in by the thousands, overwhelming the small analytical staff available, but each message was carefully catalogued and stored for future analysis. Cryptanalysts worked through these accumulated messages methodically, searching for exploitable patterns, procedural errors, or any vulnerability that might provide entry into the system. A typical encrypted operational message might contain anywhere from 50 to 200 five-digit groups representing the encoded and encrypted text. Individually, these groups revealed absolutely nothing to casual inspection. They appeared to be random numbers, and without knowledge of the encryption system, they might as well have been random numbers. But when thousands of messages were compared systematically, when analysts looked for patterns across the entire body of intercepted traffic, rather than focusing on individual messages, patterns began to emerge from what had seemed like chaos. Certain code groups appeared more frequently than others, suggesting they represented common words or phrases. Messages with similar headers often used similar opening groups, providing clues to the meaning of those groups. When Japanese operators made mistakes, as human operators inevitably do, despite the best training and the strictest procedures, those errors created tiny windows into the system that skilled cryptanalysts could exploit to gain broader access. By December 1941, when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, American cryptanalysts had achieved partial but significant success against JN25. They could read perhaps 10 to 15% of intercepted messages, a percentage that varied depending on the specific type of message and how recently the codebook or additives had been changed. This level of penetration was sufficient to track major fleet movements and identify general patterns of Japanese naval activity. but it was insufficient for detailed operational intelligence that could predict specific attacks or reveal detailed battle plans. The attack on Pearl Harbor itself demonstrated both the value and the severe limitations of cryptanalytic intelligence as it existed in late 1941. American code breakers had detected unusual patterns in Japanese naval activity during late November 1941, including changes in radio traffic that suggested something significant was being planned. They had successfully read portions of diplomatic messages that indicated deteriorating relations and possible military action, but they couldn't read enough of the operational naval traffic to determine the specific target of any attack or the precise timing of military action. The attacking fleet that sailed from Japan maintained strict radio silence during its approach to Hawaii, eliminating any possibility that radio intercepts could provide warning. This complete tactical surprise, achieved despite America's cryptanalytic efforts, produced a crucial and painful lesson that shaped all subsequent work. Partial code breaking, while valuable for strategic intelligence, wasn't enough to prevent operational surprise. American cryptanalysts needed to achieve comprehensive and deep penetration of Japanese communications if they were to prevent future Pearl Harbors. The weeks and months following Pearl Harbor transformed American cryptanalytic operations from a small, specialized effort involving dozens of people into a massive intelligence organization that would eventually employ thousands. The urgency driving this expansion was obvious to everyone involved. Japan had achieved total surprise once, demonstrating superior operational security and catching America completely unprepared despite efforts to monitor Japanese activities. This could not, absolutely could not, be allowed to happen again. The consequences of another surprise attack of similar scale might be catastrophic, potentially knocking America out of the Pacific War entirely. Commander Joseph Rochefort, who led the cryptanalytic unit at Pearl Harbor, designated Station Hypo, received authorization to expand his team dramatically and to request whatever resources he needed for the effort. Within months, his basement headquarters in the 14th Naval District Administration Building housed dozens of cryptanalysts, linguists, translators, and clerical staff working around the clock in shifts that covered every hour of the day and night. The operation consumed enormous resources by the standards of the time. Each cryptanalyst required substantial support staff to manage the avalanche of intercepted messages that arrived daily, to maintain the elaborate filing systems that tracked individual code groups, and to handle the administrative burden of processing thousands of pieces of paper. IBM punch card machines, primitive by modern standards, but revolutionary for their time in 1942, were installed to perform statistical analysis that would have required months of manual calculation. Thousands of index cards carefully tracked individual code groups and their possible meanings, creating a massive cross-reference database that allowed any analyst to quickly determine what was known about any particular group. The basement became a factory of secrets, an intelligence production facility processing thousands of messages monthly in search of the fragments of exploitable information that could be pieced together into actionable intelligence. Station Hypo's success depended on three parallel efforts that operated simultaneously and fed information to each other in a continuous cycle. First, linguistic analysts and translators worked on the portions of messages that had already been decrypted, translating the Japanese text into English and analyzing it for operational significance. Second, cryptanalysts focused on attacking the mathematical structure of the codes themselves, using statistical methods and pattern analysis to identify new code groups and extend American understanding of the encryption system. Third, traffic analysts studied the radio networks themselves rather than message content, mapping Japanese command structures and fleet organizations from call signs, transmission patterns, radio frequencies used, and the network architecture revealed by who communicated with whom. These three approaches, combined systematically with each component supporting the others, could reconstruct Japanese plans and intentions, even when large portions of individual messages remained encrypted and unreadable. A message that was 70 or 80% unreadable in terms of actual text might still reveal critical operational information if cryptanalysts understood the context, recognized the sender and recipient from call signs, and could read enough fragments to determine the general subject matter. The power lay not in reading every word of every message, but in piecing together enough fragments across enough messages to reconstruct the larger picture. By February 1942, just 2 months after Pearl Harbor, Rochefort's team had made dramatic and accelerating progress against JN-25 that would prove decisive at Midway 3 months later. The Japanese Navy had changed their additive tables immediately after the Pearl Harbor attack, a standard security precaution when launching major operations, and this change had temporarily blinded American cryptanalysts by rendering their previous work on the additive system useless. But the fundamental codebook, the dictionary that converted words to numbers, had remained the same, and within weeks of intensive work, Station Hypo had reconstructed enough of the additive system to resume reading significant portions of Japanese traffic. The breakthrough came from a combination of patient mathematical analysis and deep operational knowledge. When Japanese ships reported weather conditions, a routine part of naval communications, cryptanalysts could make educated guesses about the plain text based on known weather patterns and standard reporting formats, then work backward through the mathematics to identify the additives that had been applied. When messages contained standard military phrases that appeared frequently in military communications, such as routine acknowledgements or common procedural language, those predictable elements created entry points into the encryption that could be systematically exploited. The first major success demonstrating the operational value of improved code breaking came during the Japanese offensive in the South Pacific in early 1942. Rochefort's team read enough of the operational traffic, piecing together fragments from dozens of messages, to predict with confidence that Japan was planning a major attack on Port Moresby in New Guinea, intending to cut Allied supply lines and threaten Australia. This intelligence reached Admiral Chester Nimitz, who immediately grasped its significance and took action. The warning enabled Nimitz to position American aircraft carriers to intercept the Japanese forces, leading to the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942. Though the battle itself was tactically inconclusive, with both sides taking significant losses and neither side achieving a decisive victory, it demonstrated the transformative power of signals intelligence for naval operations. American carriers, warned by cryptanalysts about Japanese intentions and approximate timing, had intercepted a Japanese force that expected to operate unopposed or at least undetected until they reached their objective. The Japanese were shocked to find American carriers positioned directly in their path. The psychological impact on Rochefort's team was electric. They had proved their value in actual combat operations. They had demonstrated that their work in the basement could affect battles at sea. Now they needed to do it again, on an even larger scale, with even higher stakes. The intelligence that would ultimately shape the Battle of Midway and change the course of the Pacific War began arriving at Station Hypo in early May 1942. Japanese radio traffic increased dramatically in volume, with substantially more messages being transmitted than had been typical in previous weeks. This surge in communications activity alone suggested that major operations were in preparation, even before analysts could read the actual content. Traffic analysis indicated the formation of multiple task forces, each consisting of dozens of ships, suggesting a major operation rather than a routine deployment. The volume and patterns of communications suggested something far larger in scale than any previous operation since Pearl Harbor. Rochefort's team worked frantically around the clock to read the accumulating messages, knowing that somewhere in this flood of encrypted traffic lay the details of Japan's next major move. What they found as they broke through the encryption was startling in its ambition and frightening in its potential consequences. The Japanese Navy was planning an operation that would commit virtually every major warship in the combined fleet, including all of Japan's remaining large aircraft carriers, representing an all-out bid for decisive battle. The target of this massive operation appeared frequently in the encrypted messages, designated consistently by the two-letter code AF. But the critical question that had to be answered before this intelligence could be acted upon was simple yet crucial. What was AF? Where exactly was Japan planning to strike? Traffic analysts at Station Hypo had compiled extensive lists correlating Japanese geographic designators with actual locations, a painstaking process that required comparing hundreds of messages and looking for context clues. Some designations were obvious through repeated use and clear context. AH was Pearl Harbor, referenced so frequently in Japanese traffic and in contexts that made its identity unmistakable. Others required careful deduction and sometimes educated guessing, followed by confirmation. AF appeared frequently in messages that also mentioned the Central Pacific region, and contextual clues suggested it was a target somewhere in that general area. But the exact identification remained uncertain. The precise location was critically, vitally important for American planning, and could mean the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat. If AF was somewhere in the Aleutian Islands to the north, and American carriers were positioned at Midway in anticipation, those carriers would be completely out of position and unable to affect the battle. If AF was Midway itself, as Rochefort increasingly suspected based on traffic analysis and context, then American forces could be positioned to set a devastating ambush. But Rochefort needed absolute confirmation, certainty sufficient to convince Admiral Nimitz to commit America's few remaining carriers, risking them in a battle where being wrong about the target location would likely result in their destruction. The solution to confirming AF's identity came from Rochefort's intimate knowledge of Midway's unique vulnerabilities and his creative thinking about how to exploit those vulnerabilities for intelligence purposes. The tiny atoll, barely 6 miles across, depended entirely on desalinated seawater for drinking water and for all operational needs. The desalination equipment was complex and occasionally temperamental, and if it failed for any reason, the garrison would face an immediate and severe crisis. Rochefort proposed an elegant deception operation that would definitively identify AF by tricking Japanese intelligence into revealing what they knew. He arranged through secure channels for Midway to send an uncoded radio message transmitted in plain English that anyone could read, reporting that the island was experiencing serious trouble with its water desalination plant and needed emergency assistance. The message was carefully crafted to sound routine and plausible rather than like obvious bait. If Japanese intelligence was monitoring American communications, as they surely were, and if AF was indeed Midway as suspected, then Japanese messages should soon reference AF having water problems. The pieces would fit together. Within just days of Midway's transmission, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message transmitted in JN-25 that reported, quote, AF is short of water, end quote. The confirmation was absolute, eliminating any possible doubt. AF was unquestionably Midway, and the Japanese were definitely coming. Now the question shifted from where the attack would occur to how America could exploit this foreknowledge to achieve victory. The decrypted messages that Station Hypo processed over the following weeks revealed not just the target, but the entire operational plan in extraordinary and almost unbelievable detail. Yamamoto's strategy, laid out in messages that assumed complete security, involved multiple forces approaching from different directions in a carefully choreographed sequence. A diversionary attack would first be launched against the Aleutian Islands in the north, designed specifically to draw American attention and hopefully American carriers away from the Central Pacific. Then, once American attention was focused on the Aleutians, the main carrier striking force, called Kido Butai, comprising Japan's 4 most powerful fleet carriers, would approach Midway from the northwest and launch devastating air attacks to neutralize the atoll's air defenses and ground-based aircraft. Following closely behind the carrier force, an invasion fleet carrying several thousand troops would land on Midway to occupy and hold it, transforming it into a forward Japanese base. Meanwhile, positioned further west and ready to spring the final trap, Yamamoto's main battle fleet, including the super battleship Yamato, would wait to intercept and destroy American carriers when they inevitably responded to the attack on Midway. The entire plan was predicated on American forces reacting exactly as Yamamoto predicted, sailing into his carefully prepared trap. The Japanese plan made one fundamental and ultimately fatal assumption that would determine the battle's outcome. It assumed that American carriers wouldn't arrive at Midway until after the island had fallen, after the initial Japanese carrier strikes had destroyed Midway's defenses, giving Japanese forces the enormous advantages of position, reconnaissance capabilities from land bases, and the element of surprise. What Yamamoto didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know given his complete confidence in Japanese code security, was that American cryptanalysts had read his detailed operations order almost as soon as Japanese fleet commanders received their copies. Every task force designation, every ship assignment, every timing detail, every assumption about American reactions, all of it had been transmitted by radio in code that Station Hypo was now reading with remarkable proficiency. Rochefort's team provided Admiral Nimitz with intelligence that seemed almost impossible, that seemed too detailed and too comprehensive to be real. They gave him the composition of each Japanese task force, listing the major combatants by ship type and often by name. They provided the planned approach routes that each task force would follow toward Midway. They detailed the timing of major events, including when the carriers would launch their initial strikes. They even provided the radio call signs that would be used during the operation, allowing American forces to track Japanese communications in real time. It was as if Rochefort's team had infiltrated the highest levels of Japanese naval command, sitting invisibly in planning conferences and reporting every decision, every discussion, every detail directly to Admiral Nimitz. The reality was, in some ways, even more impressive. They had achieved this comprehensive intelligence picture through pure mathematical and linguistic analysis of intercepted radio signals, breaking supposedly unbreakable codes through systematic effort. The intelligence also revealed crucial information about Japanese assumptions regarding American capabilities, assumptions that suggested potential vulnerabilities. The Japanese believed their code security was absolute and would remain absolute throughout the operation. This confidence led to remarkable candor in radio communications. Messages discussed operational details, logistical concerns, and strategic objectives with a level of openness that would have been unthinkable if commanders had any suspicion that enemy cryptanalysts might be reading their traffic. This confidence in encryption security produced a kind of operational carelessness that cryptanalysts could exploit. Detailed orders that should have been delivered by courier for absolute security were instead transmitted by radio for speed and convenience because commanders trusted their codes to protect the information. When changes to the plan occurred as final preparations continued, updates were broadcast by radio to all affected units simultaneously rather than being distributed through secure couriers, providing Station Hypo with both original plans and modifications. These before and after versions of orders were particularly valuable to cryptanalysts because comparing them revealed even more about the structure of the codebook and the additive system. Admiral Chester Nimitz, receiving this flood of intelligence from Station Hypo, faced a command decision that would determine not just the outcome of a single battle, but potentially the course of the entire Pacific War. The stakes could hardly have been higher, and the intelligence, while extraordinarily detailed, required Nimitz to trust it completely and stake everything on its accuracy. Station Hypo's intelligence indicated that the Japanese were committing 4 fleet carriers to the Midway operation: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were not just any carriers, but the four that had spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, the most powerful and battle-tested naval aviation force in the entire world. Nimitz could deploy only 3 American carriers in response: Enterprise and Hornet, which were available and ready, and Yorktown, which had been seriously damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea and was being frantically repaired in dry dock at Pearl Harbor. Under normal circumstances, Yorktown would have required 3 months of repairs to return to full operational capability. Nimitz gave the repair crews 3 days, and through heroic round-the-clock effort, they made her marginally seaworthy and combat-capable. Even with Yorktown's rushed return to service, the Japanese would maintain a significant advantage in carrier strength, 4-3. But the disparities extended beyond carriers. Yamamoto's supporting battle fleet included the Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever built by any nation, mounting 18-inch guns and armor thick enough to resist anything the American Navy could throw at it. This battleship force was supported by multiple heavy cruisers and dozens of destroyers. If the battle somehow devolved into a traditional surface engagement with big guns firing at each other, American forces would be annihilated quickly and decisively. The firepower disparity was simply overwhelming in Japan's favor. But Admiral Nimitz held one decisive advantage that outweighed all of Japan's material superiority. He knew Yamamoto's plan completely and in detail. He knew when the Japanese carriers would arrive at Midway, down to the approximate hour. He knew from what direction they would approach. He knew where they would be positioned when they launched their initial attack wave against Midway's defenses. This comprehensive foreknowledge, this perfect intelligence picture, enabled Nimitz to position his carriers in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. He could place them northeast of Midway, beyond the range where Japanese scout aircraft were expected to search based on their standard procedures, in a position where American carriers could observe Japanese operations while remaining undetected themselves. From this position, they could launch their own strikes to arrive at the Japanese carriers at the most vulnerable moment. In carrier warfare, which was still being invented as commanders learned its principles through bitter experience, the side that attacked first almost invariably won. Detection determined everything. Whoever spotted the enemy carriers first and launched their strike first would likely win the battle regardless of other factors. Nimitz was gambling everything, risking America's entire carrier force in the Pacific on Station Hypo's intelligence being accurate, complete, and trustworthy. The preparation for battle revealed the profound impact that cryptanalytic intelligence could have on operational planning at every level. Normally, defending against a carrier raid required extensive and exhausting air patrols to detect the enemy at maximum possible range, giving defenders time to scramble their own aircraft and prepare for battle. But patrol aircraft consumed fuel at an alarming rate and were severely limited by range and endurance. Patrol operations required dozens of aircraft searching across thousands of square miles of ocean, with no guarantee they would find anything. Based on Rochefort's intelligence, Nimitz could position patrol planes precisely and specifically where Japanese carriers were expected to appear, focusing search efforts on a relatively small area and maximizing the probability of detection while minimizing the resources required. Similarly, American carriers didn't need to search randomly across the vast Pacific, burning fuel and flight hours while hunting for an enemy that might be anywhere. They knew where the enemy would be and approximately when they would arrive. This knowledge transformed carrier operations from being fundamentally a search problem, finding the enemy before he found you, into being primarily a targeting problem, attacking the enemy whose location was already known. The psychological advantage was also significant. American pilots and ship crews knew they were flying or sailing into battle with superior intelligence, knowing what they would face and when they would face it. The precision of Station Hypo's intelligence extended even to crucial tactical details that would determine the battle's outcome. Decrypted messages had indicated that Japanese carriers would launch their attack on Midway at dawn on June 4th, timing that reflected standard Japanese doctrine for carrier operations. This seemingly minor timing detail was actually critically important for American planning. After launching a major strike, Japanese carriers would need to recover those aircraft approximately 90 minutes later when they returned from attacking Midway. During this recovery period, the carriers would be extraordinarily vulnerable. Their flight decks would be crowded with aircraft landing, being refueled, being rearmed for potential second strikes. Fully fueled aircraft would be sitting on deck. Ammunition would be exposed and easily ignited. Bomb carts would be positioned near aircraft. The entire carrier would essentially be a floating fuel depot waiting for a spark. If American carrier aircraft could arrive during this critical 90-minute window, catching Japanese carriers in the midst of recovery operations, they would find ideal conditions for a devastating attack. Nimitz planned his entire operation around this precise piece of intelligence. American carriers would position themselves to launch their own strikes, timed to arrive at Japanese carriers exactly when those carriers were most vulnerable, when they were recovering their own aircraft and unable to launch immediate defensive fighters. The communication of intelligence to operational commanders at various levels required extremely careful handling to protect sources and methods. If Japanese forces detected unusual American preparations that suggested foreknowledge, if they saw American carriers positioned in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, they might suspect that their codes had been compromised and implement emergency changes to their communication security. Such changes could potentially blind American intelligence at a critical moment. Nimitz absolutely could not broadcast to his commanders, quote, "We have broken Japanese codes and we know their entire plan," end quote, without risking catastrophic security failure that would compromise not just this operation, but all future intelligence efforts. Instead, intelligence was compartmentalized strictly on a need-to-know basis. Most commanders and their staffs received intelligence information presented generically as coming from, quote, "reliable sources," end quote, without any specifics about the nature of those sources or the methods used to obtain the information. Only a handful of senior officers were told about Station Hypo's cryptanalytic success, and they were sworn to absolute secrecy. This compartmentalization, while necessary for security, created its own challenges for operational planning. Some commanders receiving intelligence that seemed impossibly detailed and suspiciously accurate questioned whether it was genuine or whether it might be Japanese deception, an elaborate ruse designed to lure American carriers into a trap. The intelligence seemed too good to be true, too comprehensive, too perfect. Rochefort's personal reputation for brilliance and integrity, combined with Nimitz's complete confidence in Station Hypo's work, ultimately convinced skeptics that the intelligence was genuine and should be trusted completely. As Japanese forces sorted from their bases in Japan and the Pacific in late May 1942, Station Hypo monitored their communications continuously, providing Nimitz with near real-time updates on fleet movements. Traffic analysis tracked each task force as it departed its home port, identifying command ships and force composition from radio traffic patterns even when messages themselves were encrypted. When Japanese carriers maintained strict radio silence as they did to preserve operational surprise, as they had done successfully before Pearl Harbor, traffic analysts used radio direction finding and network analysis to estimate their positions. Direction finding stations at multiple locations could triangulate on radio transmissions, providing rough position estimates. Network analysis, studying who communicated with whom and the patterns of those communications, could identify command relationships and fleet organization even without reading message content. The combination of decrypted messages providing strategic intelligence, traffic analysis providing operational intelligence, and direction finding providing tactical intelligence created a comprehensive picture of Japanese movements that would have seemed magical or impossible to naval commanders in previous wars, or even just a few years earlier. Nimitz knew where his enemy was at any given time. He knew where they were going. He knew what they planned to do when they arrived. This level of operational awareness was completely unprecedented in the history of naval warfare and gave America an advantage that would prove decisive. The psychological preparation of American forces for the impending battle reflected the confidence that came from possessing superior intelligence, even if most personnel didn't know the source of that confidence. Pilots who would fly from American carriers in what would be the most important mission of their lives were briefed on Japanese forces and Japanese plans with a level of detail that inspired confidence. They understood they would face 4 enemy carriers, knew the approximate composition of Japanese air groups, and most importantly knew that those carriers could be caught in a vulnerable state during aircraft recovery operations. Submarine commanders were positioned along Japanese approach routes with specific patrol areas assigned based on decrypted routing instructions, giving them the best possible chance of intercepting major Japanese warships. Even Midway's garrison, the soldiers and marines who would defend the island against the expected Japanese onslaught, had been warned of the impending attack with enough advance notice to prepare optimized defenses. Additional aircraft had been flown to Midway in the days before the attack. Defensive positions had been improved. Ammunition had been stockpiled. Supply depots had been moved to less vulnerable locations. Every element of American preparation, from the highest strategic level down to individual tactical decisions, leveraged intelligence that the Japanese believed was impossible for any enemy to obtain. The Japanese Navy's absolute confidence in the security of their codes was rooted in both technical assessment and cultural assumptions that shaped their entire approach to communication security. Japanese cryptographers were highly trained professionals who had studied mathematics and cryptography at Japanese universities. They had analyzed American cryptanalytic capabilities based on published academic work and intelligence assessments, and they had concluded that JN-25's complex 2-stage encryption system was secure against any attack that didn't involve actually capturing the physical codebooks. They calculated that reconstructing 45,000 codebook entries and determining the additive patterns would require decades of work, even for a large team of cryptanalysts. They didn't fully understand or appreciate that American efforts involved not just dozens, but eventually hundreds of people working with the assistance of early computing machines, applying industrial-scale resources to the problem of code breaking. They were thinking in terms of a small team working with paper and pencil, not a massive organization with mechanical assistance. Cultural factors also shaped Japanese security attitudes in ways that made them overconfident. The Japanese military emphasized discipline and proper procedure above almost everything else. Japanese radio operators were trained extensively and held to exacting standards. They rarely made mistakes, and when errors occurred, they were typically minor and infrequent. What Japanese cryptographers didn't fully appreciate was that even infrequent errors, small mistakes scattered across thousands and thousands of messages, could accumulate to provide sufficient exploitable material for sustained cryptanalytic attack by a large organization specifically designed to find and exploit those errors. June 3, 1942. As Japanese carrier forces approached Midway from the northwest, steaming through rough seas under overcast skies, American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were already in position approximately 200 miles northeast of Midway, exactly where Rochefort's intelligence had indicated they should be to intercept the Japanese striking force while remaining outside the expected Japanese search area. Patrol aircraft from Midway flew carefully planned search patterns based on expected Japanese approach routes rather than searching randomly. At 9:25 a.m., a Navy PBY Catalina patrol bomber spotted the Japanese carrier force, transmitting an excited contact report. Quote, "Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320 degrees, distance 150 miles. End quote. The sighting confirmed Station Hypo's intelligence with remarkable precision that would have been shocking if anyone had time to consider the implications. The Japanese were exactly where American cryptanalysts had predicted they would be, approaching from exactly the expected direction, at exactly the anticipated time. The intelligence had been perfect. Aboard the Japanese carriers, confidence remained absolute despite the long journey across the Pacific. Admiral Nagumo Chuichi commanded the carrier striking force with the same 4 carriers that had achieved overwhelming victory at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. His pilots were veterans who had destroyed the American battle line, who had sunk British capital ships in the Indian Ocean, who had swept Allied air forces from the skies over Southeast Asia. They were the best carrier pilots in the world, flying from the best carriers in the world. Now they would eliminate Midway's defenses as the first step toward luring American carriers into Yamamoto's trap. The operation was proceeding perfectly, according to their carefully developed plan. What Nagumo didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that his plan had been read in Washington and Pearl Harbor weeks earlier, transmitted securely to American commands, analyzed in extraordinary detail, and used to position 3 American carriers in exactly the right location at exactly the right time to devastate his force. The Japanese were sailing confidently into an ambush, unaware that every move they made had been anticipated, every intention known, every assumption about American ignorance completely wrong. At 6:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Nagumo launched the first wave against Midway, exactly as American intelligence had predicted he would. 108 aircraft departed from the 4 Japanese carriers, carrying bombs optimized for attacking land targets. The strike departed on schedule, leaving Japanese carriers temporarily unable to strike naval targets effectively because their remaining aircraft were armed for a second strike against Midway if needed, not for attacking ships. This was exactly the vulnerability that Rochefort's intelligence had identified and that American planning had been designed to exploit. For the next 90 minutes, Japanese carriers would be recovering the Midway strike force and preparing for possible follow-up operations, during which time they would be extraordinarily vulnerable to carrier attack from an enemy they didn't know was nearby. American carrier commanders, informed of Japanese intentions and timing through intelligence channels, had already launched their own strikes hours earlier, carefully coordinating attack times to arrive during this predicted window of maximum Japanese vulnerability. The battle that followed demonstrated both the tremendous power of intelligence advantage and the harsh limitations of that advantage when execution doesn't proceed perfectly. American torpedo bomber squadrons, attacking first without fighter escort due to coordination failures during the approach, suffered absolutely catastrophic losses that shocked everyone who witnessed them. The Japanese combat air patrol, those Zero fighters orbiting above the carrier force specifically to protect against attack, destroyed virtually every attacking torpedo bomber with ruthless efficiency. Of 41 torpedo bombers from 3 American carriers that pressed their attacks, only 6 survived. The Japanese shot them down one after another, killing most of the pilots and aircrew who had flown with such courage into overwhelming defensive fire. The attacks appeared to be a complete and disastrous failure. But these seemingly futile attacks, these sacrificial charges by doomed torpedo bombers, had actually pulled Japanese fighters down to low altitude where they could pursue and destroy the slow-moving American aircraft. The Japanese combat air patrol was completely focused on the torpedo threat at wave-top level. Meanwhile, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, arriving at high altitude during the chaos, found Japanese carriers in the worst possible situation for defense. Japanese fighters were at low altitude and couldn't climb quickly enough to intercept. Japanese carriers had their decks crowded with fully fueled aircraft being rearmed and prepared for launch. In approximately 5 minutes that would change the course of the Pacific War, American dive bombers struck Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu with multiple bomb hits that set off massive secondary explosions and uncontrollable fires. Bombs detonated among fueled and armed aircraft on deck. Aviation fuel ignited in rivers of flame. Ammunition exploded in sympathetic detonations. All three carriers were transformed from powerful warships into burning wrecks that would ultimately sink or be scuttled. Hiryu, operating slightly separated from the other carriers, escaped the initial attack, but would be located and destroyed later that afternoon in a second American strike. The destruction of 4 fleet carriers in a single day represented losses that shattered the Imperial Japanese Navy's offensive capability irreparably and permanently. Japan had entered the war with 10 aircraft carriers of various sizes, including fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. They had now lost 4 of their most powerful fleet carriers, a 40% reduction in carrier strength in a single catastrophic engagement. American industrial capacity, just beginning to reach its full wartime potential, would replace American carriers lost in battle with new construction that was already underway. Japanese shipyards, lacking similar industrial capacity and raw materials, could not replace these losses on any reasonable timeline. More critically, for long-term Japanese naval aviation capabilities, Japan lost approximately 110 trained and highly experienced pilots at Midway, naval aviators who had trained for years before the war and had combat experience that couldn't be quickly or easily replaced. The combination of lost carriers and lost aircrew meant that Japan's offensive carrier capabilities had been broken in a single day. The mathematics of industrial attrition, shaped decisively and fundamentally by cryptanalytic intelligence that had enabled perfect American positioning, had turned irrevocably against Japan in one morning of intense combat. In Tokyo, where news of the disaster arrived slowly and was initially disbelieved, the shock was profound and the recriminations began almost immediately. Japanese naval leadership struggled to understand what had happened. How had the Americans positioned carriers exactly where they needed to be? How had they known to strengthen Midway's defenses with additional aircraft in the days immediately before the attack? How had their carrier aircraft arrived at the precise moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability during aircraft recovery operations? Some Japanese intelligence officers, reviewing the circumstances, suspected that codes might have been compromised, but most commanders and cryptographic experts rejected this possibility outright. The mathematics of JN-25 were sound. Japanese cryptographers had assured everyone that the system was unbreakable. Therefore, it must not have been broken. The Americans must have gotten extraordinarily lucky, benefiting from a combination of coincidences and Japanese tactical errors. This conclusion, though comforting to Japanese egos and consistent with their confidence in their own capabilities, was absolutely and fatally wrong. American cryptanalysts had read Japanese plans completely and comprehensively. They had known everything, and they would continue reading Japanese communications, exploiting Japanese overconfidence in their code security for the remainder of the war, providing intelligence that would shape every subsequent American operation in the Pacific. The codebreakers in the basement of Station Hypo had won the Battle of Midway before the first aircraft launched, before the first bomb fell, before American and Japanese forces even made visual contact with each other. Their mathematical brilliance, their systematic methodology, their tireless work attacking codes that were supposed to be unbreakable had given Admiral Nimitz the one advantage that mattered most: perfect knowledge of enemy intentions. They had proved that in modern warfare, the nation that can read enemy communications and understand enemy plans holds an advantage potentially more decisive than any weapon system. Admiral Yamamoto had believed his codes were mathematically unbreakable and had planned his operations with complete confidence in that security. Commander Joseph Rochefort had proved him wrong, and in doing so had changed the course of history. The invisible war fought with mathematics, and encrypted messages had determined the outcome of the visible war fought with bombs and bullets on the vast Pacific Ocean.